Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Today I want to talk about how our universe came into existence. How did we get here? Was it random chance with lots and lots of time, or was there an intelligent designer behind all of this? And there's people watching, I'm sure, who have doubts, and that's okay. I want you to watch and ask questions. We are going to get some good answers, I think, here today as well. Before we dive in, a quick reminder to hit subscribe. And our guest today is Dr. Steve Osborne. He joins us from Northern California. He's a former atheist, actually, and now a Christian apologist. Go figure. And he has a doctorate in experimental psychology. He's the author of a new book called Beyond Chance: From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. Now that is available at steveosbornebooks.com. All right, Steve, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you bet. Looking forward to the conversation today. Why don't you just off the top tell us a little bit about yourself? Because, again, you were an atheist for many years as well as a scientist. So what was it that caused you to change your mind and start believing in the God of the Bible?
Okay, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version, which is really hard for me. By the way, I call myself not an atheist, but a godless pagan.
Okay.
And I have to tell you, I was really good at it. So I was a godless pagan for nearly 30 years. I wasn't hostile to God. I just wasn't interested in God. I'd managed to live a pretty difficult life as a young adult without God. And I was at a position where I wasn't interested in God and frankly didn't need God. So it was about the time I was a third year student in graduate school, and my wife went back to church and accepted Christ, and I watched her life completely transform, which is a sort of a miracle in its own. But because of her, I started to get involved in church and Bible studies, mostly to support her, not because I was interested in religion or Christianity, but I loved my wife and I wanted to support her. And I just kept getting more and more involved in Christian activities. And I loved the people. I wasn't interested in the message. But then I got challenged to take a hard look at the evidence for Christianity. And I was given a book by Josh McDowell called Evidence That Demands Verdict.
Well, that's funny because that's a book that brought me to Christ as well. Wow, that's cool. Okay.
So reading that book was like a severe slap in the face for me for several reasons. I defined myself as a scientist. I ate, breathed, lived, and did science. It's who I was. And all of a sudden, and by the way, I taught and preached that people should understand and know what they believe and why they believed in it needed to be based on evidence. And all of a sudden, I'm confronted with the fact that I had completely disinterested in Christianity. I had dismissed it without ever looking at the evidence. So I sort of felt like the world's biggest hypocrite. So that kind of led me more into the faith, and I ended up in what I call a pretty severe spiritual battle. On the one hand, I thought, this Christianity stuff, it's just a bunch of hooey. I don't want to be involved in that. And then the other side was sort of like, well, this really does kind of make sense. And the people we know that are Christians are really different people. So I kind of went back and forth and back and forth. And I sort of went from being pretty happy with my life to being pretty miserable. So I decided, like a lot of people before me, that I would simply use my intellect and my scientific background, and I would go through the Bible, and I would be able to show that, in fact, it was myth and it was simply made up. So I started reading and studying the Bible, and I was quite surprised to find out that it wasn't so easily dismissed. And in fact, it was brutally honest, and you find people writing things that nobody would make up. Peter, for example, denying Christ 3 times. Nobody makes up a story that makes themselves look bad.
Right.
And the other thing that really got my attention was that women discovered the empty tomb. Now, if you know anything about first century Roman Empire people, and especially in Israel, women had no position in society. They weren't even allowed to testify in court. All of that to say is nobody would believe the testimony of women. So if you were making up a story, the last thing in the world you'd do is have women discover the tomb.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
all of that kind of just led me deeper and deeper and deeper. And then finally, sitting a pickup truck in a parking lot one day, a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm taking this evangelism course, and I really need to practice this thing called the four spiritual laws." Now, if you're familiar with that, it's a way to lead somebody to Christ. So
Hmm.
he read through the laws, and he got to the end, and he said, "Would you like to accept Christ?" And it just became crystal clear. All of my concerns, all of my excuses, etc., just completely disappeared. And I said, "Yes, I would." And my poor friend Damien, I thought he was going to have a heart attack. He was so surprised. So I accepted Christ into my life.
Hmm.
That was about 49 years ago. So I think it's going to work. I tell the story on myself. I was so arrogant at the time. I said to God, "Okay, look, I accept you as Lord and Savior. I'm all in, but I'm going to give you 40 days. We're going to do a trial for 40 days. And if I still think I like this stuff in 40 days, I'll continue to be a Christian. Otherwise, I'm going back to being a godless pagan." Well, I think we know how that story turned out.
Right.
So that's how, C.S. Lewis describes himself as a reluctant convert. Uh,
Hmm.
I felt the same way. I was
Gotcha.
probably among the least likely people on the
Hmm.
planet at that time to become a
Yeah.
Christian.
Yeah, again, because you've got that whole science background and you need evidence to figure things out here. So, well, let's get into that again. Your book, again, called Beyond Chance From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. So, a lot of folks don't think that faith and science are compatible. So, how do you see that as a scientist and then also now as a believer?
The concept that faith and science are incompatible is terrible misinformation. And in fact, if we turn back the hands of time, we'll find out the men responsible for basically implementing modern science were nearly all Christians at the time.
Hmm.
If not Christians, they were certainly deists. And that they believed that by studying nature, they were literally reading the mind of God. So by understanding creation, they thought they could better understand the creator. And incidentally, that is the birth of modern science.
Hmm.
So this concept that science and Christianity and science and the Bible being incompatible is not true. If we look at science just from an evidentiary standpoint, we find that from the moment the universe sprang into existence, from that time forward, that the landscape is littered with scientific evidence for the existence and majesty of God. So
Hmm.
one of the lines in my book that I really like, even though I wrote it, I guess, is science does not erase God, it reveals him. And it's true.
Hmm.
Science reveals
Yeah,
God. So if you
I,
look
I,
at
I
true
like
science,
that.
if you follow the evidence, you'll find it leads right to the foot of the creator.
Yeah, I like that line for sure. Yeah, I think what happens is this scientists perhaps, I guess, stray away from some of their own principles, and that is to be truly scientific, you need to include all the possibilities, right? And you examine all of those without leaving some apart. So the tendency is, of course, for scientists to be materialistic only, naturalistic only. So we leave the spiritual dimension completely outside, although it obviously is something that is very real in many people's lives. And I'd say even beyond that, it's reality, whether or not you believe it. But if we put it outside of our possibility of thinking, then we never go there. We never pursue any evidence pointing in that direction. So, you asked the question here again: is it reasonable to believe that nothing produced everything, and that life comes from non-life, which is essentially, that materialistic scientific view, right?
Exactly. And in fact, the beginning of the universe, as you might expect, is one of the most incredible, fantastic, astonishing, extraordinary events in the history of time. And quite frankly, no event in the history of time better illustrates the existence of God than the beginning of the universe. Uh, if you wind back the hands of time 13.8 billion years ago, all we have is this teeny tiny point, probably smaller than an atom, that scientists call the singularity. And then in an instant, this teeny tiny little dot of nothing exploded, okay, not like a hand grenade, but in this precise explosion that basically ushered in time, space, and matter. So from something, I say smaller than an atom, I'm not sure people relate to that. So imagine something the size of a grain of salt, okay, expanding to something equivalent to the size of a galaxy in 1/trillionth of a second. Now,
Yeah, it's really hard to wrap your mind around it. Yeah.
no, by the way, the truth is the beginning of the cosmos is so astonishing, it far exceeds our mind to comprehend. And there's no word in the English language that allows us to describe it. Now, here's I think, the really cool part about the beginning of the cosmos. Science cannot explain the singularity or the beginning of the cosmos for the simple fact that science did not exist at the moment the cosmos came into being. The laws of nature came into being with the universe. So at the time of the singularity and its initial expansion, science did not exist as we know it today. Now, here's another, I think, wonderful thing. If we look at the sort of the 5 attributes that would have been necessary to cause the universe, if we look at those attributes, we find out that they perfectly match the God of the Bible.
Okay. Very briefly, what are those attributes as you would see it?
Well, the infinite nature of God, God being before or apart from the universe, God having infinite power, God having the intelligence to create the universe in the order and precision with which we see today. Now, let me do kind of sort of a mini commercial. All of that is in the first chapter of my book, which people can go to my website and download for free and read.
Wow.
So I don't want to spoil the entire story. But
yeah, and it's hard to get into a snippet of time that we have here on the interview, But I really appreciate actually the way that the way you write the book. It's actually pretty easy to understand in layman's terms, and this stuff gets fairly complex, right? So, and it's fascinating, as you point out, that the vast majority of scientists today, although that wasn't the case, 200 years ago, but now they believe the Bible's claims that the universe actually had a beginning. The Bible talks about that, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So, very interesting that they agree with the Bible in that. So, is the idea of having, an intelligent designer, a purposeful creator, is that reasonable and plausible?
The truth is, there's no better explanation than the divine creator brought the universe into being. One of the things we do as scientists, especially for historical science, like the beginning of the universe, we go back and take a look at the evidence, and we gather all the evidence, and based on that evidence, we try to arrive at what we believe is the best explanation. So I will argue scientifically that the best explanation for the beginning of the universe was an intelligent force. By the way, that's a scientific statement. Now, I happen to believe that intelligent force was God, and you can make a case for that. Now, when I say it's God, now that's religion. But if I say it was an intelligent force, we're still at the science level. And quite
That's
frankly,
true.
you can't get from no universe to the universe without some sort of intelligent force. And by the way, that force has to be unimaginably powerful. As you said, something from nothing. How about something smaller than a grain of sand expanding to a mass of 93 billion light years across, with up to 2 trillion galaxies, each of which has millions to billions of stars, from something smaller than a grain of salt?
Yeah, again, incomprehensible. You write about DNA, talk about complex.
Yes.
And I mean, this is coded information that gives genetic instructions. So, I mean, this points, toward design, does it not?
It does.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to talk about DNA a little bit here.
Well, rather than specifically DNA, let's talk about the origin of life on Earth. So
Okay.
we talked about the origin of the universe, and I think we can make a pretty good case that God was involved there, at least some sort of intelligent force. So now let's get to first life. So we take a look at Earth. It's this barren rock. Okay, it's not exactly friendly to life, and we go from non-life to life, and we have to say, "Wow, how did that happen?" And the answer is it is impossible for that to happen without some sort of intelligent assistant. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but principally, life is so incredibly complex. The parts are so interrelated that getting from non life to life, frankly, is mathematically and statistically impossible without some sort of outside help. So you talked about DNA. That kind of gets us to a level of complexity that's hard to do in an interview. I will just say that DNA is a language. It's a code. I think we're all familiar with Morse code of dots and dashes, and,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
when we understand ASCII code, then we touch a letter on our keyboard that's basically turned into binary. Well, the same thing happens biologically. When we go inside of DNA, we have these things called nucleotide bases. And when we read across three of those, that's called a codon. And a codon specifies an amino acid, and proteins are made of long strings of amino acids, but it's the code. And it's just like Morse code, it's like ASCII, it's like binary. So nobody would imagine that Morse code came about by accident. Code comes from the mind, okay? So the same thing when we look at DNA, which is a very, very precise, elegant language that only contains four letters, I might add, the four different bases. So out of those four bases and the 20 amino acids that they specify, we are able to make every living thing that's ever existed. Okay. And
Yeah.
once again, to imagine that the code of DNA happened through random combinations of molecules on ancient Earth is sort of like believing in the tooth fairy.
Yeah, you write in your book here. You have an example of a riddle or a puzzle that proteins are required to make other proteins, and so it means the very first cell couldn't start just simply and gradually to build the system, but essentially from the very beginning it would need a protein, right, to keep on making proteins. So where'd that protein come from?
Well, we need
I mean, just logically, it doesn't make sense otherwise, does it?
There's some really amazing research that began in 2016, and a group of scientists wanted to specify what first life might have looked like. Okay, and so they took the simplest living thing they could find, which is a bacterium, and they started removing genes. We're made of genes, right? Our hereditary genes, and they started removing genes one at a time until the cell died. Interestingly enough, the cell still required 473 genes to survive.
Wow.
Okay? So let me see if I can do this simply. Genes basically provide the instructions for making a protein. Everything that happens in life, everything that happens in a cell depends on proteins, right? So the coding part of DNA basically provides the instructions to build a protein, right? But proteins are made from amino acids. Now, there are 20 different amino acids that living organisms use. So for just one protein, it requires on average, about 150 amino acids. But all 50 of those amino acids have to be organized in precisely the correct order or they won't work. So how hard would that be to just have random molecules on an ancient Earth bumping into each other to create just one protein? Right? So
Yeah, it's
consider
beyond
that
chance. It's beyond chance, isn't it?
to create by chance alone a single protein with just 10 amino acids, just 10, not 150, just 10, will happen one time in 10 trillion.
Oh my. Yeah, that's just
So for those who are
wow.
mathematically inclined, just to build one protein by chance is 20 raised to the 150th power, which far exceeds virtual
Oh, oh.
impossibility. And according to what's called the minimum cell, you need 473 of those. That's why I say it's virtually impossible to get from life, from
Yeah.
non-life to life without help.
Yeah. It is literally mind-boggling. You write in your book too. Again, if you're just joining us, Beyond Chance, from the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. That's available at steveosbornebooks.com. Now, you write about the fact that the universe is made up of something, or at least large portions of the universe is made up of something called dark energy as well as dark matter, which apparently is invisible. So it begs the question, right? Well, how do we know if it exists, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to jump into that for a little bit?
Sure. Dark matter and dark energy are maybe my favorite mysterious forces in the universe.
Yeah.
So dark matter makes up about 27% of the universe, and dark energy makes up the another 67%. Now, here's the fun part of dark energy and dark matter. They can't be seen, they cannot be measured directly, and they do not consist of neutrons and protons like normal matter. So, how do we know they exist? Well, we know they exist by how they influence the universe. For example, dark matter was required at the very beginning. There really wasn't enough normal matter for stars to form. So we needed extra matter. So dark matter combined provided the extra matter, and it allowed stars to form and galaxies to form. And frankly, without dark matter, you and I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Okay. Now, here's what I find fascinating. Dark matter and dark energy make up 95% of the universe. Only 5% of our universe, 93 billion light years across, are made up of things that we can see and measure. We know they exist because of how they influence the universe. Now, here's an interesting parallel. How do we know that God exists? Well, one way is by how he influences the universe, and he's left lots of evidence of his handiwork. So, if we're willing to believe in dark energy and dark matter because of how it influences the universe, why do we have such a terrible time believing in an unseen God who makes his presence known by how he affects the universe? And if you'll permit me, I want to I should memorize this, but let me read
Sure.
a short text that I think is super appropriate here. It's from Hebrews, and it says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Only
That's
2000.
amazing. That's amazing that this is in the Bible, written, thousands of years ago, right? I mean, that concept.
Oh, dear. I mean, once again, and I don't mean to plug, well, I guess I can. My book is full of stuff like this. For example, we know that the universe is expanding. Okay. It's bigger today than it was yesterday. It's going to be bigger tomorrow than it is today. And it's expanding at quite a fantastic pace. So is it not interesting that 11 times in scripture, the words make reference to God stretching out the universe 11 times in 5 different authors? Now, some people will say, well, that was just a way of saying something. Well, maybe it was, but it sure seems to fit the facts pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's again, not coincidental. It's Godcidental.
Yes, I like that
Yeah,
accidental. That's a good word.
yeah. There you go. Made a new word today. All right. And again, you talk about the fine tuning of the universe. If it wasn't precisely, where it needs to be, and you list a number of these things in your book here as well, right? Then we wouldn't exist. The universe wouldn't exist. It would collapse upon itself, right? Or it would
It
explode,
would.
or humans wouldn't have oxygen to breathe, whatever.
The fine tuning is so precise, and like the gravitational constant, I think for that to happen by chance would have happened like 1 in 10 to the 140th or 100, some ridiculously large measure. And by the way, I think a lot of us have a hard time thinking about things like 10 to the 20th or 50th,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Let me tell you, 10 to the 80th is the number of atoms in the entire universe. So when you hear something
Wow.
that occurs 1 in 10 to the 140th, you can say, hey, that's impossible. And that's what we
Wow.
find with the fine tuning. And fine tuning occurs all over the place. I don't have enough information to tell you about it, but this morning I was just messing around and I was curious about how many different colors humans can see. I knew it was a lot. It turns out to be a million,
Wow.
which is
Wow.
which is pretty incredible. And as it turns out, by the way, our visible spectrum, which is about between 400 and 700 nanometers, happens to be the exact same spectrum from the radiation from the sun. Now, maybe that's coincidence, and maybe people will say, well, we evolved to match that. But I don't think so. I mean,
Yeah.
the human body and our senses are so fine tuned. It's just incredible. And by the way,
I'm running out of time here, so I got to jump in here.
okay, I'm
So
sorry.
sorry, Steve, but 30 seconds here. What would you say to anybody doubting the existence of God?
That what?
What would you say to anybody doubting the existence of God?
Oh, I would say, please go look at the evidence. And by the way, I'm happy that people doubt God. I would like people that are skeptic, if in
Okay.
fact it leads you to seriously look at the evidence, because I know if you go look at the evidence, it's going to get your attention. It's not hidden under a rock. It's out there, it's visible, and it's abundant, and it's compelling.
Wow, thank you so much for your time today. I want to steer people to your website, Steve. Again, Beyond Chance, From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb at steveosbornebooks.com. Dr. Osborne, thank you. You're onto something here for sure. As you say, the heavens don't whisper God's existence, they shout it. All right. God bless. WizeUp.ca.